Story 1. The Stranger in the Security Camera. Jack Thompson had been a security guard for years. Working the night shift at a sleek, modern office building in the heart of the city was usually uneventful. The building was quiet, the halls dimly lit, and the hum of the security monitors was the only noise that filled the control room. But something strange started happening one cold autumn night that would haunt Jack's every waking moment. It was 2:37 a.m. When Jack first saw it. On the security monitor, a shadowy figure stood directly in front of the building's entrance. It was a tall man, wearing dark clothes, his face obscured by the camera's low-light filter. Jack frowned, leaning closer to the screen. The man stood eerily still, not moving an inch. Concerned, Jack grabbed his flashlight and hurried downstairs. As he swung open the glass doors, cold air hit him, but there was no one there. The street was empty, save for the distant hum of cars passing by blocks away. He checked every corner, but the man had vanished. Shrugging it off as a glitch in the camera, Jack returned to his station. The next night, at exactly 2:37 a.m., the figure appeared again. Same spot, same posture, standing perfectly still. Jack felt a cold chill creep down his spine. Something was wrong. His pulse quickened as he grabbed his flashlight once more, determined to catch the intruder this time. But, like the night before, no one was there when he arrived at the entrance. The street outside was deathly silent, and the only movement was the wind stirring the leaves. Each night after, the same routine played out. At exactly 2:37 a.m., the figure would appear on the screen, motionless, faceless, hauntingly present. But no matter how quickly Jack rushed to the scene, the man was always gone by the time he arrived. Jack began to lose sleep, his nerves fraying as he became obsessed with figuring out what was happening. One evening, Jack asked one of his colleagues about the strange occurrence, hoping for an explanation. The other guard, a grizzled older man named Carl, paled when Jack mentioned the figure. "You've seen him too," Carl whispered, his voice shaky. "Years ago, when I first started here, I saw him, same time, same place. I checked every camera, searched every hallway. He's not real, Jack, but he is there." Disturbed by Carl's admission, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the shadowy man. He began reviewing footage from the past weeks, meticulously scanning for any clue. That's when he noticed something terrifying. The man's shadow, while faint and distorted, was growing clearer, more defined with each passing night. And worse, it seemed to be getting closer to the building's entrance. Then, one night, everything changed. At 2:37 a.m., the figure appeared, just as it always did. But this time, it wasn't standing still. The man had moved, his face pressed against the glass doors, his body contorted in an unnatural posture, as if he were trying to get inside. Jack's heart hammered in his chest. For a moment he froze, staring at the screen. Then the lights in the control room flickered and went out. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his flashlight. When the lights came back on, the camera showed the entrance empty once again. But Jack knew something was different this time. The room felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch across the walls, darkening everything around him. He no longer felt alone. That was when he heard it, the faint sound of breathing, raspy and uneven, coming from right behind him. Jack turned slowly, his heart in his throat, but there was no one there. The room was empty. But the sound persisted, louder now, as if whoever, or whatever, was getting closer. His legs felt weak as he backed away, his eyes darting to every corner of the room. In a desperate attempt to end the nightmare, Jack left the control room and sprinted down to the entrance, hoping to confront the figure one final time. When he reached the glass doors, he saw him, standing just outside, closer than ever before. Jack's breath hitched as the figure slowly raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. A cold mist formed around the handprint, and for the first time Jack could see the man's face. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at him, and a twisted grin spread across his pale, gaunt features. The door creaked open, but before Jack could react, everything went black. When the morning shift arrived, they found Jack slumped in the control room, unconscious, the cameras still rolling. They rewound the footage to 2:37 a.m. The figure appeared again, standing motionless, staring through the camera. But this time, as it approached the doors, it didn't disappear. It walked inside. And Jack was never the same after that night. He quit his job, never spoke about what happened, and refused to return to the building. But every so often, the new guards would report strange things on the night shift. And at 2:37 a.m., the shadow of a man would appear on the security camera, watching, waiting, forever lingering in the dark. Story 2. Footsteps in the hospital. St. Catherine's Hospital was an old, sprawling building that had stood on the outskirts of the city for nearly a century. Its stone walls had seen thousands of patients come and go, some healed, others never leaving at all. Over the years, staff had come to recognize the strange creaks and groans of the aging structure, attributing them to faulty plumbing or the building's natural settling. But the night shift held its own secrets, whispers that no one wanted to talk about. And it was during these long, empty nights that the hospital revealed its most terrifying mysteries. Sarah, a young nurse in her late 20s, had been working the night shift for just over a year. She had always enjoyed the quiet hours when the hospital seemed to sleep along with the few patients left behind. The dim lighting, the hum of machines, and the occasional soft whisper from down the hall. These were her companions during those long nights. But that all changed one fateful winter evening when she first heard them. It was a particularly cold night. The wind howled outside, making the windows rattle in their frames. Sarah sat at the nurse's station, sipping her lukewarm coffee, eyes scanning the monitors in front of her. She was just about to stand up and stretch when she heard it, the faint, deliberate sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. They were slow, measured, and impossibly clear in the otherwise quiet hospital. She froze, her eyes darting toward the corridor. There was no one there. The third floor, where she worked, had only a handful of patients that night, and none of them were mobile. Her heart began to race, her pulse thrumming in her ears as she listened. The footsteps continued, each one growing louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was approaching her. With her hands trembling slightly, Sarah stood up, grabbed her flashlight, and cautiously stepped into the hallway. The pale glow of the emergency lights cast long, eerie shadows on the walls, distorting the sterile environment into something almost malevolent. She shone her flashlight down the empty corridor, her breath catching in her throat. The footsteps had stopped. She stood in the middle of the hall, the silence around her heavy, oppressive. Slowly, she began to walk toward the source of the noise, her shoes barely making a sound on the linoleum floor. Every door she passed was closed, every room dark. There was no one there. Forcing herself to breathe, Sarah turned back to the nurse's station, convincing herself that it must have been her imagination. Perhaps it was the wind playing tricks on her, or the old building creaking. But deep down, she knew better. Something was wrong. The next night, at exactly the same time, it happened again. Forcing herself to breathe, Sarah turned back to the nurse's station, convincing herself that it must have been her imagination. Perhaps it was the wind playing tricks on her, or the old building creaking. But deep down, she knew better. Something was wrong. The next night, at exactly the same time, it happened again. Sarah had just sat down to check the patient charts when the familiar sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. This time, they were louder, more distinct, as if whoever, or whatever, was walking was closer than before. She felt a chill creep up her spine, her skin prickling with unease. She stood, gripping her flashlight tightly, and ventured into the corridor once more. The sound continued, a rhythmic thud of feet against the floor, but there was no sign of anyone in the hallway. Sarah's heart pounded as she followed the noise, her flashlight casting ghostly beams of light along the walls. The footsteps seemed to circle around her, moving ahead of her, behind her, always just out of sight. Panic began to claw at her chest, but she forced herself to keep moving. When she reached the end of the hall, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and Sarah felt as though the hospital itself was holding its breath. She stood there for a moment, listening, waiting, but nothing came. The hallway was as empty as before. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of those footsteps echoed in her mind, refusing to leave her alone. She tossed and turned in bed, her thoughts consumed by the inexplicable noise. Who or what was walking those halls? Was it a patient somehow unnoticed by the staff, or was it something far more sinister? By the third night, Sarah was dreading her shift. The anxiety built within her, gnawing at her insides as she approached the hospital. When she entered the dimly lit building, a sense of unease settled over her like a thick fog. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the old building sent her heart racing. At exactly 2:15 a.m., as if on cue, the footsteps began. This time, Sarah was ready. She stood up immediately, her flashlight in hand, and marched down the hallway toward the sound. But the closer she got, the louder the footsteps became, until they were right beside her. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, the flashlight's beam swinging wildly through the air. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued, louder now, closer. Sarah felt a chill so cold it seemed to seep into her bones. She could feel the presence of something near her, something unseen, and for the first time she was truly afraid. She backed away, her heart pounding, her hands shaking uncontrollably. As she turned to retreat to the safety of the nurse's station, a soft creak echoed behind her. Slowly, she turned her head, and there at the far end of the hall she saw it. A shadowy figure, standing still, its form barely distinguishable in the dim light. It stood in the spot where the footsteps had always started, its head tilted slightly as if watching her. Sarah's heart lurched in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She tried to move, but her legs felt like lead. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but she could feel its eyes on her, piercing through the darkness. In a panic, Sarah turned and fled, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. When she reached the nurse's station, she slammed the door shut behind her, her chest heaving with fear. She stared at the security monitors, her eyes wide, expecting to see the figure following her, but the hallways were empty. The figure was gone. From that night on, Sarah refused to walk the halls alone. The footsteps continued every night, always at 2:15 a.m., always starting in that same spot. And every night, Sarah could feel the figure getting closer, its presence stronger, darker. She could sense it watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. One evening, while digging through the hospital's records, in a desperate search for answers, Sarah stumbled upon something chilling. Years ago, on the 3rd floor, a patient had died under mysterious circumstances. The man had been found wandering the halls late at night, confused and disoriented, before collapsing and succumbing to his injuries. His death had never been fully explained. The footsteps, the figure, the icy cold presence, it all began to make sense. The man's spirit had never left. Now, Sarah lives in constant fear of the night shift. Every night, she knows the footsteps will return, and each time, the figure will draw closer. One day, she fears it will reach her, and when it does, she knows there will be no escape. Story 3, The Guard's Final Night. The Crestview Mall had always been a place of eerie silence once night fell. The aging lights cast long shadows across the glossy tile floors, and the sound of the creaky air vents could give anyone the chills. For Ethan, the mall's night guard, this was all part of the routine. He had spent nearly 5 years patrolling the abandoned corridors, long after the last shopper had gone home. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, but it was easy. Tonight, however, was his last shift before leaving the job for good. He had landed a better position in a safer, more modern building, but something about tonight felt off. The mall had an energy to it that he couldn't shake. The air was heavy, almost thick, and the stillness felt oppressive. As Ethan glanced around the security office, his eyes lingered on the rows of surveillance monitors, watching the empty hallways and store entrances flicker in and out of focus. There had been no alarms tonight, no reason for concern, but the strange tension in the air clung to him like static electricity. It was just after 1 a.m. when the first flicker of movement caught his attention on one of the screens. Ethan leaned forward, squinting at the fuzzy image. It was the camera overlooking the west wing of the mall, a place that had been largely shut down for years. No shops were open there anymore, and few people ever wandered that far. Yet, there on the screen, he saw her, a woman. She stood in front of the elevator doors, her long white dress brushing the floor. Her hair cascaded down her back, hiding her face. She didn't move, didn't make any sign that she was aware of the camera. She was just standing. Ethan's brow furrowed as he zoomed in, trying to get a clearer look. The grainy quality of the feed made it hard to see any details. Who was this woman? What was she doing there at this hour? And how had she gotten inside without triggering any alarms? He grabbed his flashlight and reluctantly left the safety of the security office, his footsteps echoing as he headed toward the west wing. With each step, the uneasy feeling in his gut tightened. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps it was a cleaning crew member he hadn't been informed about, or maybe someone from the outside had wandered in. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. When he reached the elevator, the cold air hit him like a slap. It was far colder than the rest of the mall, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The elevator doors were open, just as he had seen on the monitor, but the woman was nowhere to be found. "Hello?" His voice echoed down the darkened hallway. Silence. Ethan peered into the elevator, shining his flashlight across the empty space. It looked normal, like any other night. He stepped inside, hesitating as he glanced at the control panel. None of the buttons were lit. He pressed the button for the first floor, and the doors slid shut with a soft ding. As the elevator began its descent, a strange sensation came over him. The air grew heavier, and a faint metallic smell filled the small space. His chest tightened with a sense of impending dread. Ethan couldn't explain it, but the further the elevator went down, the more he felt like someone was watching him. The doors opened, revealing the basement level. It was a part of the mall rarely used anymore, mostly storage and old maintenance rooms. The dim lighting did little to push back the darkness, and the coldness seeped into his bones. Ethan stepped out cautiously, shining his light down the hallway. The shadows seemed to shift and breathe, moving in the corners of his vision. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the walls were amplifying the sound. As he walked further down the corridor, he felt the overwhelming sensation of being followed. He whipped around, expecting to see someone, or something, but the hallway behind him was empty. His pulse quickened, and the cold sweat trickling down his back only heightened his anxiety. "Get a grip, Ethan," he muttered to himself, though the words offered little comfort. But then, there it was, the faint sound of footsteps, light, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. They followed his movements, matching his pace. The noise wasn't coming from behind him, but from above. Slowly, his eyes traced upward to the security cameras lining the ceiling. Each one seemed to buzz faintly, their red lights blinking in unison. Suddenly, the elevator dinged behind him, the doors sliding open. Ethan froze. He hadn't pressed the button, hadn't called for the elevator, but it had arrived anyway. He turned slowly to face it, and his heart skipped a beat. She was there. The woman in the white dress. She stood in the center of the elevator, her back still to him, the soft glow of the overhead light casting a sickly shadow over her figure. Her hair was impossibly long, draping down to her waist, and she was unnervingly still. No movement, no sound. Ethan's mouth went dry. Who are you?" His voice wavered as the flashlight trembled in his hand. No response. The air around him grew colder, the metallic smell stronger. He took a hesitant step back, but the woman didn't move. She just stood there, like a statue, an unnatural presence that felt more like a dark stain in the air than a living person. Ethan's hand shot to his radio, but the static on the other end was deafening. No signal, no backup. He was alone. Summoning the last of his courage, Ethan edged closer to the elevator. "Miss, you can't be here. You need to leave." Suddenly, the woman's head jerked to the side, just slightly, but enough to send a wave of ice through Ethan's veins. She was turning ever so slowly, as though reacting to his voice. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest as she slowly began to pivot in his direction. When her face came into view, Ethan stumbled backward in horror. Her eyes, dark, empty sockets, stared out from a gaunt, lifeless face. Her skin was pallid, stretched too tightly over her bones, and her lips were a thin, unnatural line that curved upward into a grotesque smile. The smile of something that had never been human. The elevator doors began to close, but before they shut completely, the woman's hand twitched. Her arm moved in a jerky, unnatural motion, as though she was struggling to reach out to pull him in. The doors sealed shut with a quiet hiss. Ethan stood there, frozen, gasping for breath as his mind raced. What had he just seen? What was she? In a daze, he stumbled back to the security office, his legs weak, his breath shallow. When he reached the desk, he rewound the footage. His hands trembled as he pressed play, watching the grainy image of the elevator from minutes before. There she was, standing exactly as he had seen her. But then, as the elevator doors opened on the screen, the feed cut out. Static. And when the camera flickered back to life, she was gone. Not a trace of her left behind. Panicking, Ethan tried to switch to the other camera feeds, but one by one, they went dark. The entire mall's surveillance system flickered into blackness. In the dim glow of the security office, Ethan felt the weight of a presence behind him. He turned slowly, the oppressive silence crushing his breath, and there, standing in the doorway, was the woman. Her eyes, empty voids, locked onto his, and her smile stretched impossibly wide. That was the last anyone ever saw of Ethan. The next morning, when the day shift guard arrived, they found the security office empty. Ethan's things were still there, his jacket, his phone, even his half-eaten sandwich from the night before. But Ethan himself was gone. The footage from that night was missing, replaced by hours of static. Some say Ethan simply disappeared, while others believe he was taken by whatever haunted the Crestview Mall that night. But one thing's for certain, no one ever worked the night shift there again. Story 4, The Shadows in the Warehouse. It was Michael's 7th night in a row working the graveyard shift at Horizon Warehouse, a massive storage facility on the outskirts of town. The building was cold, lifeless, and unnervingly quiet after dark. The only sounds were the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rustle of boxes as the temperature shifted through the cavernous aisles. Stacked shelves stretched as far as the eye could see, creating a maze that swallowed any hint of warmth or human presence. At first, Michael had enjoyed the solitude. The job was simple: patrol the building every hour, monitor the security cameras, and report anything unusual. But as the nights dragged on, the isolation began to gnaw at him. The vastness of the warehouse became overwhelming, and a sense of unease had slowly crept into the back of his mind. There was something about the way the shadows played across the floor, how they seemed to move and stretch when he wasn't looking directly at them. On this particular night, the air felt heavier than usual. A thick, oppressive silence filled the warehouse, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He tried to dismiss it as exhaustion. After all, it had been a long week. But as he sat in the dimly lit security office, staring at the grainy monitors that displayed endless rows of unmoving boxes, something on the screen caught his eye. A shadow flickered in one of the aisles, a dark blur that moved quickly across the frame before disappearing. Michael squinted at the monitor, unsure if he had actually seen anything at all. Probably just a glitch, he muttered to himself, rubbing his tired eyes. But the nagging feeling persisted. Michael decided to check it out, telling himself it was probably just a trick of the light. He grabbed his flashlight, the beam cutting through the murky darkness as he made his way down the long, narrow aisles. The rows of towering shelves loomed over him like silent sentinels, casting long, inky shadows that seemed to move with every step he took. As he reached the section where the shadow had appeared on the camera, he paused. The air here felt colder, heavier somehow. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a chill ran down his spine. He shone the flashlight down the aisle, scanning the rows of boxes, crates, and pallets stacked high on either side. Everything seemed perfectly normal, perfectly still. But then, just as he turned to leave, he heard it. A faint shuffling sound, like footsteps brushing against the cold cement floor. He froze, his pulse quickening as the sound grew louder, closer. The flashlight beam wavered in his hand, and he strained to see into the deep shadows between the shelves. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely more than a whisper. There was no answer, only silence. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A dark figure standing at the far end of the aisle, barely visible in the gloom. It was tall, impossibly thin, and unmoving. For a moment, Michael stood frozen in place, unable to believe what he was seeing. He blinked, and the figure was gone. His heart pounded in his chest as he hurried back to the security office, his mind racing. He had to check the cameras again, had to make sure he wasn't losing his mind. But when he rewound the footage, there was nothing. The aisle was empty, just as it had been before. Michael leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face. It didn't make sense. He knew he had seen something. The shadows, they weren't behaving normally. They moved in ways that defied explanation, slipping through the cracks in reality. appearing just long enough to be noticed, but always vanishing when approached. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but the sense of unease never left him. The next evening, as Michael arrived for his shift, he overheard two co-workers talking in hushed tones near the entrance. They were swapping stories about the strange things they'd seen during their late shifts, shadows moving through the warehouse, strange noises, and even a chilling whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. "Did you hear about Steve?" one of them whispered. "He quit last week after something spooked him during his rounds. Said he saw a figure standing in one of the aisles, but when he got closer, it just disappeared. Swore he'd never come back." Michael's stomach twisted. He wasn't the only one. That night, as he patrolled the aisles again, the shadows seemed even darker, more alive. Every time he turned a corner, he half expected to see the figure again, standing silently in the distance. But nothing appeared. Yet, the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. As the clock neared 3 a.m., Michael sat in the security office once more, his eyes glued to the monitors. That's when he saw it again, this time clearer than before. A shadow, more defined than just a trick of the light, moving deliberately through the aisles. It didn't flicker or waver like a glitch. It moved with purpose. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Grabbing his flashlight, Michael made his way to the location shown on the camera. The warehouse was deathly quiet, save for the soft echo of his own footsteps. As he approached the aisle, the air grew colder, as though the very warmth had been sucked from the space. His breath fogged in front of him, and the silence was so thick it felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. The flashlight beam barely cut through the darkness, and every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, contorting as if trying to escape the light. Michael's heartbeat quickened, a deep sense of dread settling in his bones. He stepped deeper into the aisle, his hand shaking as the light bounced across the floor. Then, out of nowhere, the shuffling sound returned. This time it was louder, unmistakable, footsteps echoing through the aisle, growing closer and closer. His throat tightened, fear gripping him as the shadowy figure appeared at the end of the aisle again. This time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving toward him, slowly, deliberately. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he watched in horror. The figure was no longer just a dark silhouette. As it moved closer, its features began to take shape, tall, gaunt, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by darkness, but Michael could feel its gaze locked on him, cold and unrelenting. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps quickened. The shadow was closing in. Panicked, Michael turned and ran. His footsteps echoed loudly in the vast emptiness as he sprinted down the aisle, the sound of the shadow's pursuit growing louder behind him. He didn't dare look back. All he could think about was reaching the exit, getting away from whatever was following him. As he reached the door to the security office, he slammed it shut behind him, locking it with trembling hands. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, but the fear wouldn't subside. The footsteps had stopped, but the sense of being watched remained. He could feel the presence on the other side of the door, waiting. Michael sat down, staring at the monitors, hoping the shadow had disappeared. But there it was, standing just outside the office door, motionless once again. Story 5, The Mysterious Knocking. It was almost midnight, and Emily was once again the only one left in the office. She had been working late shifts at her firm for a few months now, ever since her promotion. The pay was better, but the empty, silent office after hours had started to unnerve her. At night, the familiar open space of desks and computers took on an eerie atmosphere, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. She sat at her desk, the glow of her computer screen the only light in the room. As she typed away, a soft knock came from the door at the end of the hallway. Emily paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She listened carefully. It was faint, almost so quiet that she thought she might have imagined it. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as the building settling or the wind rattling the door, and returned to her work. A few minutes later, the knock came again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. 3 sharp raps against the heavy wooden door. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The office was on the top floor of a 6-story building, and the only entrance was through the front doors downstairs, which were locked after hours. No one else should be there. She stood up slowly, her chair creaking as she pushed it back. Grabbing her phone, she made her way down the dimly lit hallway toward the door. Her footsteps echoed on the tiled floor, amplifying the growing sense of unease that knotted in her stomach. When she reached the door, she hesitated. There was no sound now, just the deafening silence of the empty building. Holding her breath, she slowly turned the knob and opened the door, peering out into the dark hallway beyond. Nothing. No one was there. The hallway was empty, just as it had been every time she had checked before. She stood there for a moment, feeling foolish for letting her imagination get the better of her. With a sigh, she closed the door and locked it, returning to her desk. But as soon as she sat down, the knocking resumed. This time, it was more urgent, louder. The knocks came in rapid succession. Knock, 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 echoing through the office. Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. Her pulse quickened, her hands clammy as she stared at the door, now partially obscured by the shadows of the dim office lights. Her rational mind tried to convince her it was just a prank, or perhaps maintenance workers who had forgotten something. But there was something unsettling about the way the knocking stopped every time she got close, only to start again once she returned to her desk. She stood up again, her heart racing as she approached the door once more. This time she swung it open quickly, hoping to catch whoever or whatever was on the other side. But again, the hallway was empty. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. Her eyes scanned the dark corners, but there was no sign of anyone. The air felt cold, almost too cold for a summer night. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. Returning to her desk, she sat down, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the keyboard. But before she could resume her work, the knocking began again. This time, it was different. The knocks were slower, almost deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was toying with her. Emily's breath quickened, her chest tight with anxiety. She grabbed her phone and called security, explaining the strange occurrences. The guard on the other end of the line assured her he would come up and check things out. Minutes felt like hours as she sat there, waiting for the guard to arrive. The knocking continued, rhythmic and relentless. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was all in her head. But with every knock, her nerves frayed further. Finally, the security guard arrived, his footsteps heavy in the hallway. He checked the door and the surrounding area, but just like Emily, he found nothing. "Are you sure you're not just hearing things? It could be the building settling, especially at this hour," he said, his tone dismissive. Emily nodded, though deep down she knew it was something more than that. The guard left, leaving her alone once again in the oppressive silence of the office. For the next hour, the knocking stopped, and Emily allowed herself to believe that maybe it had been her imagination after all. But just as she began to relax, the knocking returned, louder, more forceful than before. This time, the knocks didn't stop when she stood up. They grew louder, faster, like someone pounding on the door with urgency. Her heart raced as she rushed to the door, yanking it open with trembling hands. No one was there. The air was still and cold, the hallway silent as ever. She slammed the door shut, her hands shaking. She couldn't take it anymore. She packed up her things, ready to leave the office and never look back. But as she gathered her belongings, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. It echoed through the office, almost as if it was coming from the walls themselves. Terrified, Emily rushed toward the exit, her breath shallow and her mind racing. But before she could reach the door, the knocking stopped. And then a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Let me in." Emily froze, her hand on the doorknob, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked back at the office door, now eerily silent, but something in the air had changed. It felt oppressive, like she was no longer alone. Without waiting another second, she flung the exit door open and bolted down the stairwell, her footsteps echoing in the empty building as she fled into the night. The cool air outside was a stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere inside, and she didn't stop running until she was safely in her car. Emily never returned to the office at night again, but the knocking never stopped. Colleagues who worked the late shift after her reported hearing it too, those same 3 knocks, night after night. And like Emily, no one could ever explain where they came from or why they never found anyone on the other side. But one thing was certain, something was knocking, and it was still waiting for someone to open the door.